I don't have a ton of time, but I'm taking 3 years worth of work and cramming it into 10 minutes. And what I'm talking about is talking about collaboration in agriculture and using an example of a project of how to collaborate and how agriculture industry has been collaborating in southern Alberta. So I'm going to use the SSRB Adaptation project as an example of how the industry is doing that in the Bow Basin. And then I'll talk about collaborative processes used in the SSRB. So how are we doing it? So there's the how with the process, and then what we've learned from doing the process in the Bow River Basin. So this is the South Saskatchewan River Basin, or the SSRB for short. It's been in the news a lot lately. When Susan had you raise your hands, most of you are from Alberta. So this is the SSRB. It's made up of the Red Deer Basin to the north, the Bow Basin, which we're in right now, the Old Man to the south, and then the South Saskatchewan River Basin to the southeast of us. So the 4 sub-basins combined are the SSRB. We are doing modeling in all 4 sub-basins right now. The Bow is the furthest along. That work's been going on since 2010, where the Bow River project came to a set of recommendations on how the Bow River could be remanaged in order to support future economic growth, population growth, and enhance the environment. So the SSRB Adaptation project, it's a collaborative project. It's about exploring practical opportunities and options for adapting to climate change. So it has a very specific focus on adapting to change. And whether you talk about climate change or climate variability, what you believe about climate change doesn't really matter. The fact is climate always changes, and in order to adapt to changes, you have to know what's coming or what could come. So this project focused on the opportunities of looking at what could happen in the future based on what we know from the past. Again, this work follows on the work from 2010 from the Bow River project, so we kind of had a jump start with the Bow, which is why we have gotten farther ahead with the Bow. There are several streams of work, including the Old Man modeling, which is happening right now, as well as the South Sask, and then the Red Deer modeling just started this spring and will go for another 1.5 years. So when we talk about the collaborative process, we talk about getting folks together. Well, who are the folks, right? Who are the participants? For the SSRB Adaptation project in the Bow, these are all the participants. We have all 3 Bow irrigation districts, so we have the Western, Eastern, and Bow River irrigation districts. We had municipal groups such as the City of Calgary, Calgary Regional Partnership, and different municipal counties and districts. We had academics at the table. We had Government of Alberta, 3 different departments that were all critical in the water field, as well as fisheries and wetlands experts. So anybody who could really make an impact in terms of changing or opportunities to change how the river was managed or adapting to changes were sitting at the table. So those are the people that were involved, and so you get the people in a room and you have to actually be able to do something with them. So we have what we call the collaborative modeling process, and it has lots of different names, but it's a very simple process, and the fact that it gets all the people in the room, the knowledgeable people that have a passion that's been talked about in earlier sessions today, that actually have a passion and want to make a difference. And you get those people in the room, and the process is fairly straightforward. It uses 4 basic steps. The first step is development of what we call performance measures. Now, performance measures are developed by the stakeholders and the participants. Typically what they are is they're graphs or plots, something that's meaningful to a particular stakeholder in the system. It can be a plot of changes in flows at a particular point in the river, changes in storage to agricultural reservoirs or even private reservoirs. It could be shortages in a system. It can be recreational days, fish spawning days. We have about 100, or maybe not 100, but 60 performance measures that were built for the Bow River. Along with the development of performance measures, you develop the model. So we use a collaborative modeling or an interactive modeling tool that actually allows for the exploration of opportunities. When you develop the model, it's also done with the stakeholders. So it's an open and transparent process where the modelers work with the stakeholders to put the data in. Often the data comes from the stakeholders, so they can see it, they can see the logic in the model, and they can understand how it's processing the data and what the outcome actually means, so that if it doesn't look right, we can change it and modify the model. Once the model and the performance measures have been developed and built, we can start testing the model and exploring opportunities. So these are the kind of what-if scenarios. They can be infrastructure related, so what if I put a new dam on the river? Or what if I decided to build a spillway around Calgary? Or any of those kind of things. They can also be management related. So what if I decided to change the time at which I filled my reservoirs? And you can explore all these different things in the model with the stakeholders, and you use the performance measures to gauge the difference between the runs. So you can always compare back to the current situation and the current operations, which the model sets up as a base case. The fourth and final step is reaching consensus and implementation. This happens after many interactive modeling sessions. You start to narrow down some of the really good what-if ideas, or some of the more plausible ones, and you start to narrow them down and refine them to the point where people start agreeing and reaching consensus on them, and then you can build towards implementation. So that was the process, and again, I mentioned building the modeling tool or the interactive tool. This is the Bow River operational model, and that was built over the last 3 years and used during the Bow River project and now for the SSRB adaptation project. This is the example of the tool that has the Eastern Irrigation District right there, the Western Irrigation District is there, Bow River Irrigation District down here. Here's the Highwood and the Sheep sub-basins, so where High River was that was badly flooded. Here's the upstream reservoirs that are privately owned by TransAlta, which allow remanagement of the Bow, which I'll touch on in a sec. And then here is the city of Calgary and the surrounding region. So it's an interactive model. It shows the demands. So it's a mass balance supply demand model, and it allows people to just kind of interact with what if I did this, what if this changed, and what changes might impact the system and how can I adapt. So I've kind of gone over who's involved and the process and the tools that were used. The question is, well, why? Why did you guys do this work? So going back to 2010, stakeholders in the Bow wanted to get together to look at how could we use existing infrastructure to remanage flows on the Bow to better meet the current needs of water users and into the future, as well as improve the environment. So the Bow is already a managed system, so it's not like we're trying to control a river that's pristine and untouched. The natural hydrologic or hydrograph is the dotted blue line, and as you can see, we dam up or store a lot of the spring runoff, and then we let it go in the wintertime, which actually allows the city of Calgary to be here, because waste assimilation from the city this size would not happen if we had the natural flow passing through the city of Calgary. So since it's already a managed system, we can actually remanage it or look at how it could be remanaged in a different form. So the question was for this project was, well, what about climate change, or the climate changes? How do we know how it changes, how it could change? So we could have just picked some numbers or developed some hypothetical scenarios, but what we wanted to do was base it on science. So we worked with Dr. David Sachin out of the University of Regina for the Park Institute, and he does a lot of work with historical tree rings. So he takes tree rings and correlates it to stream flow records, and he can actually backdate annual flows, rough annual flows, and he has this one for the SSRB all the way back to about 1402, and I think he's extended it back to about 1100 right now. So what he does, and if you look at the gray lines, that's annual flows, but if you look at the 15-year moving average and then you see these dotted lines, that's the variability that we've seen in the last 100 years. So in the gauging record, that's how variable the system has been. But when you look at the prehistoric record, you can see that the highs and lows, so the droughts and the floods that the SSRB have seen in terms of natural flows without man-made dams, without climate change discussions, the natural variability of the system is greater than anything we've ever seen in the historical gauging record. So that's something that has happened, and so literally could happen, and with climate change and the intensification of cycles could be exacerbated or even increased in some situations. So you could have longer droughts or higher flows, like flood flows. So in order to be able to kind of plug that information into the model and explore the what-if scenarios, how would we adapt to those? What we did was we created 50 future climate scenarios and chose 5 to work with. The 5 that were chosen were to look at how could we adapt to future extreme conditions without impacting normal operations? Because normal operations happen most of the time, that's why they're normal. But you want to be able to function in normal and prepare and be ready for the worst. So what we did was we took the 67-year historical data, which is the dark black line, and we wanted to find 2 scenarios that were normal. And those 2 scenarios, when we ran them through the model, they didn't cause any significant problems. There was no shortages. it was very similar to the historical flows. When we picked the more severe scenarios, and it wasn't even the most severe scenarios, when we picked some of the more severe scenarios, they were fairly dry, and we graphed the 2000 to 2001 dotted line. That was a recent drought in southern Alberta that caused significant shortages and problems throughout the system. And so I graphed that just to give you an indication of how dry some of those scenarios were. And those 3 dry scenarios that we ran through the model caused significant impacts to storage and caused shortages throughout the system. So those were the kind of scenarios that we wanted to run through the model and then have the stakeholders say, how would we manage this, or how could we manage for this? So again, this is the model that we plugged those scenarios into. I've highlighted the Basin Dam right there. It's not very clear, but that's the big red circle, and I'll talk about that in a sec. For all of the bow work that we've done, the flows below Basin that's Erwin alluded to, that's the last major diversion in the Bow River, so where the Eastern Irrigation District pulls their water. Below that was kind of used as a proxy for environmental health. So we kind of use that as a performance measure to say, okay, if we can increase flows below Basin, then in theory water has gone through the entire system and actually improved environmental conditions. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is a list of adaptation strategies that were developed during the SSRB adaptation project. The bow portion of the work has just recently wrapped up. And so on the left, there's just a couple things I wanted to note. On the left are what we would call the normal condition strategies. And so these were developed, these kind of came out as something that could be implemented now. Most of them were not huge excessive reservoirs or any big infrastructure changes, but things that could be done now. And they would actually improve aquatic ecosystem health and actually provide opportunities for economic growth and developments, and could be used to help the basin in more severe conditions. On the right-hand side, we had the more drought conditions. These would be more geared towards preventing impacts or trying to mitigate the impacts from more severe droughts. And once in place, they could be beneficial throughout the system during times of normal times. A couple caveats on this that I have to say. We are not, just because people can go back and read this afterwards, we're not actually, these are not all the adaptation strategies that could possibly be. These are just the ones that were actually modeled through the process. Time and budget were limited. The other things is none of these are being recommended or advocated for, so we're not advocating for a certain dam or a reservoir or anything like that, but they're there as starting the discussion of what could happen. And then obviously any major infrastructure options, we didn't do a full evaluation in terms of environmental impacts, but that would need to be done if anything were to go ahead or be seriously looked at. Oh, and so the one example that I'll be going over quickly today is implementing the preferred scenario. This was actually the recommendations that came out of the Bow River project back in 2010, and it was somewhat refined with the trigger through the adaptation project. So I'll just touch on that briefly. So as I mentioned, the flows below Basin there, which is the last major diversion. The preferred scenario included a concept of the water bank. And when I showed the schematic of the model, I showed the upper part of the bow and had all those little green or red blue triangles, and those are the transalta reservoirs. And all those reservoirs, the water bank concept was essentially using the reservoirs and a portion of the inflows that the basin users below could actually call that water. So it's kind of like a mini storage bank using all the reservoirs, so existing storage, but the stakeholders being able to call the water when they need it. And that was to improve environmental performance. And as I indicated, the performance measure that showed whether the model run is doing better or worse was looking at flows below the sono. So the idea was to decrease the orange bars, which were lower flows, and increase the green and purple bars, which were higher flows. And compared to the current operations, which is today's situation, versus the preferred scenario with the trigger, you can see that that opportunity would provide additional benefits to the environment through Basano if it were implemented. Obviously, this is just a model. It's Robo River. If actual humans were running the system, they could use that same concept and do it a whole lot better. But it's an opportunity, and that's what the model's there for. It's an opportunity to explore what could be done, and obviously humans are smarter than computers most of the time.
Yeah, we'd like to think so.
Not me all the time, but. So what does all this tell us? So I've kind of gone through the process, and the bow work is just kind of wrapping up. But what it tells us is the bow is complex and it's managed, but it also provides us opportunities. So there's opportunities to work with TransAlta. They are privately owned and operated, but there's opportunities to work with the government of Alberta and TransAlta to try to either negotiate a deal or to try to start piloting some of these options. The other thing is water management in southern Alberta already is complex, and it'll become even more important and complex in the future as we have growing populations, economic expansion, and changes in climate, which we don't know what will bring in terms of stream flow water availability, but it will change. The other thing is that as we were going through the adaptation options, adaptation planning and testing should actually begin now, as there are strategies that can be implemented relatively easily and cost effectively now, as well as start looking at some of the ones that could be implemented for long-term serious drought conditions. And if those were to go in, they should be looked at in more serious detail. And that's it. That was 3 years compressed into 10 minutes.
Really good.
And all of this work is fully publicly available. In fact, the models that were used are available online. The whole idea was this is open, this is public, and we want people to use it. So if you're interested, all the work is available through a series of reports on the Alberta Water Portal. You can go up there. The models are available on the University of Lethbridge servers, and you can always contact anyone at WaterSMART or myself if you have any questions.